Hello, we're looking at tales of institutioning and commoning, participatory design process with a strategic and tactical perspective. This paper is interesting given its description of a few different projects and also the terminology of commoning. A little bit, the parts that escape me at the moment are there's some interesting things about institutions and institutioning in PD and research, which are not necessarily aspects that I fully grasp at the moment, but are interesting nonetheless. So there are sections that I've highlighted quite early on in the document, which are still puzzles to me, essentially. So these are the first couple of sections, which are about institutioning was introduced to the PD community and how design projects immersed in the public realm participate in the stabilization and making and renewing of the frames through which the institutional actions of a project can be conceived, the metacultural frame. I think that I'm interested in some of these words more so than fully grasping their meaning at the moment. So design projects immersed in the public realm participate in these stages or these aspects, and this phrase about how that can change or renew the way a project can be conceived, which is interesting to me, and projects in my mind being open source software projects. There's also some highlights here about the constraints about PD and restricting long-term design engagement and ideological differences. I think that I may have highlighted this because the interest that I have in the ideological differences between design or the potential ideological differences I have in mind between design and technical development, which is often the more dominant aspect of open source software projects than design, which is the technical coding development of things. The next section, just to zoom in here so that I can read easy, is which does instead we concentrate on the situational processes in which design researchers can find themselves involved when engaging with projects where institutioning, commoning, and infrastructuring are all legitimate and useful lenses for analysis, therefore involving design researchers, institutional actors, and grassroots communities at the same time. I think that this is just an interesting statement in and of itself because of the inclusion of all these kinds of different stakeholders, and I'm interested in these situated processes where design researchers find themselves involved with all these different actors, grassroots communities, all at the same time. To manage the social, material, and political conditions that define the complexities of the PD process. So design research find themselves between institutions and grassroots communities working against this. And I think that institutions is an interesting phrase to make, because when designers participate in open source, what is their institution? So their institution could be the company that they work for, if they work for a company. It could be their freelance commitments. It could be that they work for a university. So there are interesting things to be thought about when we think about the conflict between designers as part of whatever institution they consider themselves part of, and then the grassroots communities, which we can refer to as the open source communities, as a grassroots community, and the complexities then of the political conditions and the complexities of doing PD in that space. And I think that this is interesting because it's just an aspect I think about around design and open source, in that designers are rarely, if at all, the few that are paid to work on open source or paid as maintainers. I don't think that's as a popular concept for designers, as it's not really even particularly popular concept or practice for developers to be paid to do open source or maintain their open source projects. But I think then inevitably we need to think about when we are researching, when I'm researching design being done in humanitarian and human rights open source software, and how designers participate in open source software and human rights open source software. what is the institutional influence that they bring in from whatever institutions, or however we want to describe their institutions. Okay, so PD, institutioning, we illustrate two processes referring to a design research collaboration approach. The first process, co-optation, refers to the involvement of design researchers by institutional actors in a process in which the institutional actors are strategically pursuing their own agenda. The second process, intermediation, refers to design research strategically approaching and involving the institutional actors. So this is just the two different approaches that the designers are taking, I think, to involve institutional actors, one in which there is an agenda being pushed, and the second in which the designers are free, for lack of a better term, to involve the institutional actors in the way that they see fit. And in further sections and further highlighted sections, I'm interested in the descriptions of the relationships between design researchers and grass communities under this kind of commoning aspect. So first, we've got a section which is highlighted. Acknowledge that we use a model depicted in Figure 1 for conceptual analytical purposes to illustrate. Be aware that the worlds of institutions, grassroots communities, and designers are not easily compartmentalized. So here within the diagram, it talks about like the relationship between these spaces, and then that they can't be really compartmentalized. I would be interested to acknowledge and understand better what role, like, so designers have this commoning role and this institutioning role, and there's a redundancy between grassroots and institutions. But what does that mean for designers' role within open source? I'm just going to pause a second. Okay, so this this then goes into a description of a particular project with a city and a co-workshop. It's interesting, but it's more about the activity and things that happen within that workshop or that project. And I think the next section that I really paid attention to is the let's see. Let me see. We've got a section around commoning. So here we've got the relationship between designers and grassroots communities can be framed in terms of commoning. That is grassroots practices that nurture social collaboration and the emergence of collaborative subjects. So and I think this no, I'm not really sure where this is even going. So as you can see from the pausing and restarting recording, I'm having trouble with this paper. I think I had trouble with it when I was reading it and really truly sort of understanding from what position they were coming from. But I think the reason that I highlighted that section is if we look at designers and grassroots communities and the grassroots communities as open source software projects, it would be interesting to investigate the relationship between designers and open source communities being framed in terms of commoning and around grassroots practices that nurture social collaboration and the emergence of collaborative subjects. So I think that is the interesting aspect of this sentence when you reposition or replace grassroots communities in terms of open source software communities. We've got here like a detail of one of the projects, and I was curious about whether it was open source or not. So he talks about the Common Fair project, aimed at designing a digital platform called common-fair.net as a way of exploring, recognizing, and promoting grassroots forms of welfare provision. And then they go on to speak about what that actually is and does in more detail a little bit later. So it talks about people subscribing to a digital platform to share their stories and initiatives, which to me describes a process of open source contribution. So it's interesting that this paper talks a lot about the commoning from institutions, grassroots communities, and designers, but does not touch on, and then has a technological aspect to it, but the open source ness hasn't come into it at all, from what I can tell, or if it has, then it's very hidden. They then go on to describe this other part of the Common Fair project being a digital currency called Common Coin, that reward the people that submit stories. So that's their kind of like reward for contributing, is Common Coin. It kind of makes me think of the transactional nature of contributions, and a little bit about how to encourage contribution through badges and various other means done in open source. But anyway, so I became a little bit too curious about the methods and the things that were made within this paper, and it more in like this curious way that felt very very much like where these were made in the open with participatory design practices and processes, and they talk a lot about commoning and these different connections between different kinds of groups, but they don't talk about like openness at all, like, and methods of contribution. So it's just a bit curious and interesting for me. An alliance between designers and NGOs addressing critical issues such as precariousness, low income, and unemployment, which has resulted in mutual cross-pollination of terms of events and technologies developed. Again, I find it mostly curious and mostly highlighted because of the lack of open source or openness principles described in the rest of the paper and as part of the explanation of the project. It just feels like to me, a piece missing, but I may be reading a little bit too much into it. The next section I've got highlighted here is the role of designers in this respect is that of fostering the design of socio-technical assemblages, methods, processes, technologies, and theories which conflicts and shared positions can be articulated and collectively addressed, and then design can contribute to the relation between grassroots and institutional actors by both introducing new technical components, by reusing others already developed and experimented in other contexts. And again, I found it just very strange that this is describing a process of, remixing, redistributing, using other associated technologies, likely open, or open source, and it just find it very, very strange that maybe within this paper, commoning and commons and common is used in to replace or in the same way as open source and openness. Anyway, a lot of the projects describe the nature of how the commoning process and the different process between the different kind of actors in the space were done, and kind of what happened, more so than openness. So the next bit is almost redundant in situations. Almost redundant institutions can that can involve participants, especially grassroots communities, in their adversarial relationships with institutions. In situations, it's yeah. So anyway, when I read this, I immediately thought of big tech in open source. Just purely from the adversarial relationships with institutions. It's kind of not necessarily a focus of my PhD research, but it did make me think about the nature of institutions, relationships to designers, what they're bringing, how they're bringing that in, and the kind of these adversarial relationships to open source communities. It's an interesting topic to delve into, but I'm not really particularly clear on what I want to poke at here. The next bit that I've got highlighted here is stuff about existing literature, combining two lenses, different positions researchers can assume a wider relationship between institutions and grassroots community. In particular, we stressed how we aimed at focusing on the processes in which design researchers can find themselves involved when engaging with projects in which institutioning, commoning, and infrastructuring are all legitimate lenses to look at a project. I think that within the work that I'm doing, within the research that I'm doing, I would be interested in what the legitimacy of these lenses to look at an open source software project. So looking at probably the lenses of institutioning, commoning, and infrastructuring in some way, shape, or form, at the very least, kind of understanding them a little bit better. I think this also comes into more focus or more importance when we think about institutions in terms of the human rights and humanitarian institutions that participate in humanitarian open source software and the relationship there. Next is opportunities to make radical alternatives visible. There was just a tale from the Common Fair project that there are opportunities to make radical alternatives visible. That's something that I have read a few times now about PD or just design within this kind of space. So we acknowledge that this is far from being a comprehensive account, but building upon institutioning and commoning, we found ourselves lacking the language to describe our position in such processes. Telling tales from our design work has helped us illustrate some of the processes design researchers can experience, the risk of co-optation and the merits of intermediation, the potential formation of publics and the experience of entanglements, as well as the not necessarily negative possibility of rendering ourselves redundant in pursuit of legacy and continuity. I mean, no wonder it seems to be quite a confusing space to be in, but I do wonder if there is the missing piece that they haven't necessarily found within this is the openness and open source sort of piece. Well, that's just a guess more than anything, or like a kind of maybe that would help refocus or provide a different lens. But that section did make me think about how it's difficult. This isn't necessarily a reflection on the paper, but it's more of a reflection on how difficult it is for designers to describe their positions and in open source and their processes within open source, and that telling tales from design work might help illustrate those, and might help illustrate the examples which I can use further on in my research. So all in all, even though it was a paper that I thought could reveal some interesting things about commoning from an openness perspective or from a technological commons kind of perspective, it turned out to be kind of tangentially useful, tangentially relevant, only with a few sort of things that I could really sort of understand within the lens of open source, maybe a little bit too far away from the stuff that I'm trying to do, or maybe this is a lens that these researchers might find useful in some way at some point. We'll see.